Today, we're diving into a pretty controversial book that lays out a very specific, and I have to say, provocative history of the war in Ukraine. Our goal is to walk through the author's central claims. So the source we're pulling from is The Inevitable by Ukrainian journalist Diana Panchenko. Now, just to be clear, our job here isn't to endorse or debunk her views. We're simply here to explain the core arguments she lays out in her work, using slides that come directly from her book. Right from the get-go, the book hits you with this really dramatic claim. This immediately sets the stage for her main idea, that the current conflict wasn't just some recent accident, but was actually the final step in a long-term, deliberate plan. All right, so let's get into the heart of it. The author's foundational concept is something she calls the anti-Russia project. So what does she even mean by that? Okay, so this is the key term you're going to see over and over again. For her, anti-Russia isn't just a political stance. She describes it as this huge, decades-long psychological and political operation, a monstrous experiment, in her words, designed to turn her country into a weapon against Russia by filling it with a manufactured hatred. And here's the thing. Panchenko argues this project isn't some new development. She claims it has deep, deep historical roots that started with alliances forged way back during the Cold War. To back this up, she points to something much more recent, a 2023 quote from the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. The argument she's making is, see, this shows a long-standing Western preference for certain nationalist factions in Ukraine, a preference she says goes back for decades. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The author lays out this whole timeline, basically connecting the dots of what she calls a history of cooperation. She traces a path from initial contact during World War II all the way to formal agreements, arguing that as it became obvious Nazi Germany was going to lose, these Ukrainian nationalist groups started looking for new partners in the West. And she brings in some numbers to back this up. For instance, she cites testimony from a German intelligence officer who alleged that Stepan Bandera got 2.5 million German marks right at the start of World War II. Then, you fast forward to after the war. The book pulls from the memoirs of a former CIA station chief. And get this, according to that source, the CIA supported at least 30,000 Ukrainian nationalists just in the Galicia region alone to basically spy and act as an early warning system against the Soviet Union. So you have this alleged covert cooperation, right? But how does that turn into a full-blown ideological campaign? Something that targets the hearts and minds of everyday people? Let's take a look. The book brings up something called the Dulles Plan. Now, this is a purported strategy that's talked about a lot in post-Soviet countries, and she presents it as basically the playbook for this ideological war. The goal, she writes, was to create chaos from within by flipping cultural values on their head and totally discrediting anyone who tried to call out what was happening. And this next part really drives her point home. She compares these two anti-Soviet groups that were both allegedly funded by the CIA. One for Ukrainian nationalists, one for Russian solidarists. They look like twins, right? Same funder, same goal, they even use the same emblem. But look at what happened to them after 1991. One became a huge part of Ukrainian politics, while the other just faded away in Russia. She uses this to argue that the effort in Ukraine was special, that it was a focused, long-term project. So what's the takeaway here? Well, according to the author, the battlefield wasn't just physical, it was history itself. She claims that stories and narratives were deliberately rewritten to create the sense of a long-standing opposition to Moscow, even in cases where she says it just wasn't true. And she gives a specific example, a guy named Poroshenko, who was a former head of the Communist Party of Ukraine. She says nationalist writers basically took this loyal Soviet official and repackaged him as a secret hero of independence, creating this idea she calls Shelistology, which she claims is a false historical basis for separatism. Okay, so how did all these threads, the history, the ideology, get woven together after the Soviet Union fell? The author really zooms in on one particular period, the presidency of Leonid Kuchma. So you have President Kuchma coming into office on this very pro-Russian platform. He made big promises. But then there's a huge policy U-turn. He cancels this massive nuclear energy deal with Russia and Iran. Panchenko's argument is that this wasn't an accident. It was the result of direct U.S. pressure using economic leverage to start breaking those ties between Kyiv and Moscow. And this is where things get really dramatic. The author claims the infamous tape scandal wasn't just some random political mess. She presents it as a full-on intelligence operation, designed specifically to corner President Kuchma and make him totally compliant with Western demands. And to support this view, she actually uses Kuchma's own words to make her point. She pulls this quote from his memoirs where he basically describes this pattern of being deceived by Western powers, who'd allegedly promise in the world to get what they wanted and then just walk away. So the book argues this scandal wasn't just a one-off event. It was a domino. It allegedly took Kuchma off the board as an independent player, elevated figures who were much friendlier to American interests, and maybe most importantly, created a blueprint for controlling future Ukrainian leaders, completely changing the country's political path. All right, so we've followed this long, and let's be honest, pretty controversial history that she lays out, from Cold War pacts all the way to post-Soviet political pressure. What does it all add up to? What's the big question she leaves us with at the end of all this? And this really is the core question of the whole book, right there in her title, The Inevitable. The narrative she builds suggests that this conflict wasn't just a possibility or some terrible accident, but the calculated and unavoidable endpoint of a historical process that was set in motion long, long before the first shots were ever fired. A really sobering thought to end on.